Greetings, scholars, and welcome back to the last lecture before the midterm. Today we're going to wrap up that last moment right before we've got that 1490 official High Renaissance thing, which is where we're going to be concentrating most of the second half of this term on. So this last sort of seeing it coming right before the big reveal. We're also going to take a little bit of time to look at what a good art critique looks like. You've all gotten feedback on some, but how to sort of take it to the next level to do successful critiques on the midterm and for your assignments for the rest of the semester. So let's get into it. All right. The themes, the isms we're going to be talking about today are classicism, as in that hearkening back to the classical period of the Greeks and Romans, and humanism, that focus on the individual. So those are the two sort of isms we'll be talking about today. The other isms that we've got in this wind up that we've talked about in the previous lectures would be naturalism and realism. We'll certainly mention them today. Those are the sort of four isms that we are working towards the Renaissance by demonstrating in our art and philosophy. So, rest of Europe followed on as Italy introduced and developed this sort of movement towards classicism and humanism. The illusion of realism as well. We're kind of looking at the awkward teen years today as we transition from that medieval stylized aesthetic to the Renaissance. It was a 200-year build-up, so we've been spending the last couple of weeks on the previous 100 years, but now we're looking into basically the 1400s through 1490 this week. So let's look at an example again of what we're talking about here. This is Fabriano's Adoration of the Magi, early 15th century piece, 1423. The frame that you see here, this golden archway set, that is actually three-dimensional. So the painting is still secondary, a part of the architecture. So we're still kind of looking at that Gothic backup singer status for the art as sort of decoration or adornment of the architecture. So we've got a pretty complicated piece here. It's showing you multiple sort of aspects of the same narrative. We've got time passing. So let's start up in that top left archway corner here. You can see people arriving to the city on the hill. Here in the middle of the top archway, you can see the lineup outside of the city gates. We got kind of a close-up here of the city gates. You can see, if you look in tiny detail, the halos. You're seeing the three wise men, the three magi. So you can see that this is sort of snapshots of the journey. And then there they are, first in line at the adoration of the baby Jesus. Again, being able to sort of knee-jerk, what are we looking at when we have a portrait of the Virgin Mary? We've either got an annunciation where the angel is telling her that she's pregnant. We've got an adoration where the baby has been born and people are coming to adore the little baby Jesus. And of course we have the enthroned, which is the after the fact in heaven surrounded by angels thing. So those are the sort of three Virgin Mary centric types of paintings we are looking at. I hope even with blindfolded looking at a blank screen, I say, what does an adoration scene look like? You should be able to describe something like this, right? You've got the newly born baby Jesus sitting on his mother Mary's lap, and you have people lined up to adore the new Christ child. So, humanism. We're starting to move from idealized faces of that Gothic style that we've been looking at to this sort of individualized, realistic look. The humanism also sort of showing emotions, being more interested in the individual human experience. We're getting that portrayed here in a few ways that you can see people are kind of up to stuff. If you look out in the crowd, like there's people talking to each other, there's people having emotional reactions to things, there's a dude on the floor, there's people looking at the horses, there's people talking to each other. There's kind of individual expressions here. It's not like a cookie cutter stamp, stamp, stamp of human faces. Um, so we've got some naturalism happening here where we're kind of focusing on nature. That we've got a garden scene, kind of tying all the panels together. And we got some monkeys and some birds and some exotic wildlife, along with the standard ox, ass, horses, camels, dogs. So we're kind of doing some naturalistic studies here, not to the same extent that we're going to see later, but we've started paying attention to flora and fauna. So that interest in nature, the study and admiration of nature, of flowers, of animals, of the human body. Um, Classicism kind of brought to us that idea of the, you know, somebody who looks like a Greek god means that they sort of have that perfect human form. So idealizing what the human figure either could look like or should look like, depending on who you talk to, is kind of part of that classicism that we can see. Art is an imitation of nature, not an abstract of another world. And I think that's important here with even the subject matters of adorations and annunciations, because that is Mary and Jesus's early life on earth, right? Versus those early Gothic, like the Cimabue Madonna enthroned. The enthroned is always in heaven, in another sphere of reality beyond earth, outside of our sort of knowable space. Whereas annunciations and adorations are taking place on earth during a certain time frame of a human life. So it's real places, real people, sort of that real space that can kind of create, I'm going to say the word real a whole bunch. Right. So we've got a little bit of perspective going on here. And I think the biggest way that you can see it is how this procession in several of the panels, like they get smaller as they go further away. So we've got some vanishing point perspective in each of these sort of 4 sections of the scene. So there's 4 separate perspectives going on here, but we've got that illusion of depth through vanishing point perspective. We've got obviously overlapping figures, very much so. We've got some shadow and we've got some shading. I think it's easiest to see on Mary and the female figures here where we've got that sort of draping of fabric. We're starting to shade to show 3-dimensional taking up of space. I think you'll notice here, even though we've got perspective on the horses, they aren't sort of shaded and shadowed in a way that would kind of give them that 3D realistic mass in space. Also the Magi here, we've very much got highly decorated, beautiful fabrics that have real gold leafed onto them. But again, with real gold leafed on, you've only got the one color of that gold leaf, which you can see in the halo and on the brocades and details of the Magi's robes. You only have one color, and that's the gold foil. So you can't really show that outfit being shaded because you can't really cast a shadow with the gold foil. I suppose you could paint like a translucent brown glaze on top of it, but that might be kind of what's going on here at the waistband of the standing Magi. But they are looking a lot more sort of flat in that idea of shading and shadow. Not casting a shadow on the ground or on the people behind them. Not shading to show that 3-dimensional taking up of space of a form. Whereas we've got that a bit more over here because we've got the opportunity for these fabric studies on the two women and Mary seated. So there's a hint at it, but it's not consistent throughout the piece. I think another moment of humanism that we can identify here is the baby Jesus. He is squirmy and inquisitive and sort of in movement, and kind of looks like a real baby this time, instead of that medieval icon homunculus sort of thing we've been seeing up till this point. So humanism and classicism, reverence for the human individual, the human experience. And we're sort of taking that cue from the Italians. I mean, here we are looking at Fabriano. He's Italian. So let's just zoom back a couple hundred years to remember where we are coming from. So we've got this very Gothic piece here, Last Judgment. So let's look back at where we're coming from. We've got this abstract icon of God in the center. Hierarchical perspective, the more important figures are bigger than the smaller ones, without any regard for sort of vanishing point perspective or distance. So our scale is hierarchical. The really big people are more important than the teeny tiny people. We've got very abstract figures. I mean, if you look at the people down here, they are a little better than stick figures. So we don't have any sort of individuality happening here. We're far more interested in telling the story of the Last Judgment than we are with sort of thinking about the individual human experience of it. We've got that vertical symmetry where you could just like slice a vertical line down the middle, fold it in half, and it's pretty much even, if not identical. As you can see in this sort of midline panel, isn't identical, but it's balanced. We've kind of got equal amount of stuff going on either side. So are the individuals important in this piece? No, they're barely human looking, like they're a little better than stick figures. So we do not have humanism going on here. We certainly don't have any classicism going on here. The ideal human form is not at all what we're doing. We've got no sort of identification with nature or reality or a sense of space. We've also got that very Gothic, you can see that this is in an archway. It's architectural, so it is just filling that space in an architectural door archway. So it's a backup singer to the architecture. It's not sort of art for art's sake. So this is very much embodying everything that we're looking at from the Gothic. So moving into, again, we're just sort of rewinding and then zooming forward to the 15th century to sort of remind you of the baby steps. We've got Giotto. He was our first, if you recall from the previous lectures, sort of big step forward towards Renaissance ideals. This is St. Francis renouncing his father's belongings. So he founded the order, St. Francis, not Giotto, order of the Franciscan monks. They were beggars. They were interested in earthly existence and suffering. They were interested in nature. His literature talks about Sister Moon and Brother Sun, and it sounds very like 60s hippie Earth Mother kind of thing. It emphasized Christ as a human. Think about what it would have felt like to have nails driven into your hands. Think about the betrayal. So trying to sort of, instead of think about the floating figures and scary Last Judgment and what it's like for enthroned saints in heaven, rather focusing much more on the human experience of Jesus's life on earth, because we can empathize with that. Quite literally, we can feel the same sort of feelings. We can feel physical pain. We can feel betrayal. We can feel sadness. We can feel, care and love towards our fellow man. So these human experiences. So humanism in the story of Jesus's time on earth. knowledge, emphasis on the individual and your relationship with God, nature, civic duty. So this is kind of noting a change in the focus of Christianity. You can see here we've got Last Judgment and fear of God and our small, crappy lives on this earth. Think back to our plague lecture. We're just very much focusing on what happens afterwards, not this current life. So this movement, especially with the Franciscan order, towards actually taking a moment to think about the human experience on earth during our lifetimes is a big change. And so art is going to start reflecting that again. Let's have a quick recap on the illusion of 3D space on a flat canvas or wooden board or wall. So linear perspective, that vanishing point where things get smaller the further they're supposed to be away. Atmospheric perspective, when things get sort of fuzzier and more grayed out the further they're supposed to be away, like looking at a mountain range on a misty morning kind of thing. And foreshortening, kind of things that are angled towards you being artificially sort of shortened so that it looks like when something's coming towards you. The human eye organizes sights, the lines that you create with these sorts of illusions replicate our mental organization of that. You know that train tracks are parallel. So when you see them start to merge into the distance, that is how you actually see it as they vanish into the distance in real life. So your brain will read that sort of two lines converging in the distance as three-dimensional depth. So things in the foreground larger than things in the background, things overlapping each other, your brain will sort of mentally make space for that. And that's how the illusion of depth happens in art. All right, let's have this big moment, the first year of the 15th century. We've looked at the solid bronze Gates of Paradise in Florence at the Baptistry of San Giovanni before, certainly started in week 1 with the art toolkit. When the competition came out, we had everybody sort of putting in their application by doing a three-dimensional sculpture of the sacrifice of Isaac. So Isaac about to be stabbed and sacrificed by his father to show his love for God. An angel swoops in and says like, no, thanks, we're good. Here's a lamb to sacrifice instead. So Brunelleschi was a big, famous name by this point. He was a 14th century kind of superstar of sculpture, and he was really the known factor here. You can see his piece on the right. And it's very sort of theatrical. Like if they were on a thin theater stage, you've got Abraham, right? Isaac on the plinth, the angel coming in on the stage left, the lamb over here on the left. Like everything is sort of in order, like it's on a narrow theatrical stage. We're not getting any of that. Well, we're getting some illusion of depth. Like we've got a corner here to the altar that Isaac is on. So we've got a little bit, and we've got a little bit of overlap of shapes, but not in any sort of meaningful way. We've almost got like lower tier, upper tier. So it's a great piece. It's sculpted very beautifully. Each of the individual figures is very well done, but it doesn't really represent that movement towards Renaissance ideals. Whereas if you look at Ghiberti on the left here, a lot more going on. We've got overlap of shapes happening here. We've got sort of a point sticking out of the altar that Isaac is kneeling on. So it's actually jutting out into space here We've got these like great dynamic figure positions, and then look at this extremely foreshortened angel up in the upper right of Ghiberti's piece, where that's very foreshortened. It's showing a lot of movement. It's showing something sort of like zooming directly towards us. It's creating that overlap, it's depth, it's dynamic. You've got like actual action happening. Whereas I can imagine the Brunelleschi, like if you had a bunch of models and you were like, all right, everybody freeze. And so everybody pretends like they're doing the action, and they could probably freeze and hold that pose for 20 minutes. It looks like a photograph still image. Whereas there's like fluttering fabric over here in Ghiberti's. There's this angel zooming in at a pretty precarious angle that means, speed. We got these rocks toppling. We got all kinds of like action and movement, and it feels more alive. It feels more dynamic. So Ghiberti, the new guy, though the Brunelleschi is lovely, Ghiberti is showing sort of that ideas of the Renaissance more. So this is, I know I'm jumping all over the place, but just like keep with me. The dates are important because they give you hints to where we are in the historic world. So 1401, this is that very, very earliest 15th century transition. Remember, 1490, at the end of this century, precisely in 1490, we begin the High Renaissance. So we're sort of looking at that 90-year period now. Let's bookend this as the very beginning of Ghiberti sort of sparking off a real piece of Renaissance craftsmanship here on the left. Let's zoom all the way to the High Renaissance to see sort of these principles in action. Here's Da Vinci's Last Supper. So, mastery. We've got overlapping shapes. We've got shading of each individual character to show like each object, as in human body taking up space. We've got shadows being thrown by the different objects and bodies in the room. We've got perfect vanishing point linear perspective. If you remember all the lines sort of drawn for each of the vanishing point pieces in week one's art toolkit, the vanishing point sort of ends right behind Christ's head here, which draws every single line is sort of emphasizing a draw towards this focal point of the center. We've got action going on. Everybody's face is individualistic. Everybody's showing emotion. Everybody's having a reaction to this probably most awkward of dinners in human history. So you've got that humanism, and you've also got this perspective and illusion of 3D space sort of worked out. So if you track the orthogonals, we talked about those in week one as well, like you get that vanishing point. He's left us sort of plenty of traceable orthogonals in the architecture that's been depicted in itself. So that is what three-dimensional illusion looks like by the time we hit the High Renaissance. Foreshortening, I think you can see that only minimally on a couple people's body parts, like this arm being thrown straight out there is foreshortened so that it doesn't sort of weirdly look like a Go-Go Gadget arm, that it's not mathematically the same length as, oh my gosh, as this arm that's straight out, sort of horizontal. So that foreshortening gives you the illusion of the depth and makes it look more realistic. So let's just scoop back 15 years. Mantegna's Lamenting Christ. This is an attempt at extreme foreshortening, which is how we do sort of linear perspective on a single figure. The distortion makes it look like they're sort of angling back into a depth of space. This was kind of meant to be like you as the viewer are standing at the foot of Christ's bed here laid out. Not quite. We have super, super stubby short legs, quite a weirdly broad torso, and the head is way too big for what's happening here. But it was a great attempt at trying to create that illusion, which is really what we're trying to master by the time we hit the High Renaissance. So creating that 3D space, not only do we have linear perspective on the sense of space overall in the composition, but also foreshortening of the individual figures or their limbs. So this one, we're not quite there yet, but this is our awkward 15th century transition. Let's look at Masaccio's tribute money. Again, this is sort of early-ish 15th century. I think this is great because it's a good example of atmospheric perspective being experimented with. So remember, atmospheric perspective is when you're just literally looking through more atmosphere. So stuff gets like mistier and grayer as you go backwards. I think you can see that here with the mountains as they follow along the stream. But the best sort of example is you've got quite chiseled details on the figures and their robes and their individual knuckles on their fingers and their little toes. Like, it's very crisp in its details. And we've got St. Peter over here on the left with his little halo, just like washing his hands of it all. You can see he's grayer. Not only is he smaller because he's farther away, so we've got some vanishing point perspective, but he's mistier. He's less detailed. He's also a little bit grayer or more sort of cloudy. That's kind of a great example of atmospheric perspective being demonstrated in a 15th century work. So he's more muted, more blurred, as well as smaller. And that's a great example of getting there. So let's see. Let's not look at the next spoiler. Let's go back to, oh, no, that's not true. Let's bookmark again. Let's pop on over to the High Renaissance to see what vanishing point perspective looks like done perfectly. We've got Raphael's School of Athens. I mean, we will look at this like every week. I mean, we pretty much already have, haven't we? You can see that we're just looking through this building and we've got those orthogonals from the architecture. It is perfect vanishing point perspective. You've only got people in this sort of front third or quarter of the corridor. But we've got that sort of vanishing point perspective that we are moving from like bigger to smaller in that space. We've got foreshortening on limbs and things coming at us versus going away from us and side. I mean, this is a great foreshortened arm here on Aristotle. So nailed it. But you can see this corridor looks very long. Not only do we have like this one here that we can kind of measure 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 of these little like honeycombs. And so we can see that that fits that many statues, and those statues are larger than life. So that's a pretty big chunk of corridor. And then we got like a open air dome space, and then we got another one. And we assume that that is just as big. And then we got another open air space, and then we've got another one. It gives us that illusion of a very long corridor. And you can see that there starts to be atmospheric perspective on each of these, has every single bevel shadowed in. These kind of have the line indicating that sort of double beveling happening in there. And then down here, we've just got that sort of hint of the shading, the shadow. So less detailed the further we go back. And you can see that kind of here as well, where these are less detailed than that. And then the hints as we go back, there's only hints of sort of figures poking out of these niches. So it's all of the different perspectives perfectly executed to show you the depth of this very large space, this building that these figures are supposed to be in. So let's zoom back to the awkward teen years developing to this point of Masaccio. Again, 1425, so early 15th century. Linear and aerial perspective attempted here together. the illusion to imitate nature. So we've got this flat space, but we're pretending like we're sort of worm's eye looking up, and we can see quite a lot of this ceiling going back to this far back wall. We've got a bit of classicism going on, that we've got these like Ionic Greek columns. It very much looks like classical architecture painted here. The donors are in the foreground. They're very highly detailed. They look like they're in believable space before you enter this sort of columned, vaulted ceiling archway. You got to step up a step to cross for John the Baptist and Mary, and then Christ on a cross, and then God above. But if you look at God, his feet look far away. It looks like he's standing way back there on that far wall that we've made all this arched column, like sort of drum hallway barrel vault. Except then you see that his hands are actually touching the crucifix. So it's a little bit like Go-Go Gadget arms or something, where we've got a flaw in the foreshortening or the perspective of this ceiling, that it's inconsistent in terms of the illusion. Inconsistent application of atmospheric illusion as well, because we've got sort of details here and then like a mistiness where it's just hinted at as we go back on our barrel vault. We've got sort of hinted at the column Ionic capitals here, but then they're very detailed here. So we've got some atmospheric perspective going on. We've got some linear vanishing point perspective, but then the figures, the sort of organic things that you can't use a ruler to draw out quite as easily as you can with these sort of straight orthogonals, they start to be inconsistent in that illusion of 3D space. So it's not to scale. It's not either necessarily to classical proportions, but it's getting there. It's playing with how to use these methods to create that illusion of space. All right. Here, Angelico's Annunciation, again, early 15th century. This is around the exact same year period as Masaccio was working. Let's do a nice example of what a good art critique is going to look like for your midterms. This is a very good candidate for a great example of that 15th century transition, because it's an attempt at a lot of the isms that we're talking about. So in week 1, I needed you to demonstrate that you could use the terms and vocabulary that we learned in the art toolkit in week 1. You needed to be able to sort of talk about point of view, focal point, colors, line, perspective, which is what we spent a lot of time on again today, complementary, analogous color schemes. What are you looking at in the composition? What's the balance? Just being able to sort of articulate what you're looking at using those terms. Now that we've been in this class for half a semester, you take that vocabulary and your observational skills and you connect it to what that means. So here we are moving from Gothic, where we've got all of those ideas of like stylized, we're worried about after our time on Earth, we're worried about the afterlife and the celestial spheres. We're doing hierarchical perspectives. We're doing fear of God. So he's usually like a giant scary figure in the middle. And so our movement towards the Renaissance during this transition time, we've got the isms. We've got the humanism. You can see here that this is, I mean, spoilers down here, but if it was a blank screen and I said it's an Annunciation, you know who the major players are. You've got the Virgin Mary over here on the right with her signature blue robe. And you've got the angel, Gabriel, saying, hey, you are with child and it's the Son of God. So you've got Christ the Savior either in your stomach right now or quickly approaching. And Mary doesn't have to have that like stoic, dead-eyed stare that we had in the Gothic period. You've got Angelico here demonstrating humanism by giving this like a very intimate interaction. Mary looks nauseous, scared. She's sort of crossing her arms in front of her in like a defensive position. The angel is kind of showing empathy or at least sympathy by mirroring that gesture by crossing his arms in front. So we've got sort of real attempts at human emotions and human interactions and thinking for a second, what kind of scared, confused, overwhelmed moment would Mary have had during the Annunciation, rather than just have her be sort of a figure sitting there staring at you stylistically like we have in the Gothic period. We're exploring that sort of human experience of Mary getting this kind of epic news. All right, so that's the humanism. Naturalism, look at how much of this space we've sort of, I would say randomly, but I mean, legit, that is pretty random. We've thrown a garden scene in for a big chunk of the left portion of this canvas. And then it's not just any garden. We had to just make like a time jump secondary narrative going on here where that's Adam and Eve being expelled from the Garden of Eden. So we got a little history lesson over on the left there. But as you can see, we've got the angel's foot is actually sort of almost one step out into the garden. So it is still the same sort of sense of space with two very different time frames happening in the same image, in the same scene, in the same composition. So for perspective, we've got that vanishing point perspective on the architecture where you've got those sort of 3 rows of columns and 3 sort of barrel vaulted ceiling niches. And then you've got that second room that we get a peek at in the corner. Totally weird bench situation, is way too long and skinny and narrow and lifted up too high. So not perfect linear vanishing point perspective, but absolutely a solid attempt at it. Classicism, notice how the architecture has Ionic and a little bit of a Corinthian flair. It's got like Roman style columns. So we've got some sort of classical architectural elements there. Just to classicist that up a little bit. I find it interesting that Angelico has kind of gone for the Gothic, somewhat stylized faces, but then gave them real humanist emotions. All right, so we've got those attempts at pretty much all the isms that we're talking about here. Humanism, classicism, naturalism. We've got the vanishing point perspective attempted. Now we got some weird symbolism going on because we're still trying to tell a complicated story in one image, in one composition. So, if you look at the laser beam sun ray headed straight for Mary, sort of right there at that center column, it looks like a dove of peace. So we've got peace and the savior of mankind, like zooming towards Mary's either mouth or womb. Who knows what the entry point is? I assume it's only metaphorical. And if you follow that sunbeam all the way up to the sun, you see there's a pair of hands that let loose that dove. So God's hands, I guess. I mean, they are. But like an interesting sort of trying to portray an idea in image through sort of pretty wacky symbolism. We also have like a weird spoiler alert situation where if you look above the center column, that is a carving of Christ the grown man with the halo, and we assume this is after he's died for our sins, risen, and is in heaven again. So, at the moment that his mother is being told that she's pregnant with him, we've already got a carving in the architecture of this future moment. So we've got like 3 time periods happening in this one composition, where we've got the Garden of Eden, which is like Old Testament ancient history. We've got the Annunciation, and then we've got this hint towards the outcome of this story up at the top there. So again, you need to, in a successful art critique, bring us back to what we're looking at. If you can tell me what it is you are looking at, I can follow along and understand your sort of train of logic. So you can talk about the architecture as the attempt at vanishing point perspective, point out the spots that seem wonky to you. You can talk about the garden for naturalism, the expression on Mary and the angel's face for humanism. You can talk about the symbolism, the wacky sort of 3 time periods we have hinted at here. Color scheme, you can talk about what that means for the overall composition. Just make sure that you're referring to the image so I can follow along at which bit you were looking at. So you're just connecting that toolbox of terms by describing what that means for this particular time period. So you can say like, Angelico, this is an annunciation, and an annunciation is the Virgin Mary being told that she is pregnant by the angel. You can go into, this is clearly a 15th century transition, because we've got sort of interesting experimental attempts at this ism and that ism and that ism based on, humanism, their expressions. This is just me kind of walking you through what a good critique needs to do. It needs to use the terms and vocabulary that you learned in week 1's art toolkit. It needs to identify those on the painting or sculpture's composition, and then it needs to refer back to what that actually means for the time period we're looking at. You've only kind of got 2 time periods now for this midterm. You've got the Gothic period, which had one set of ideals, and then we've got this transition period that is moving towards these Renaissance ideals. So when you're looking at something, you'll be able to sort of categorize it by saying like, oh, that looks Gothic because of the hierarchical perspective and the judgment and the very stylized cookie cutter stamp faces and that all is Gothic ideology and philosophy, versus what we're looking at here is just like a perfect example of that 15th century transition because of all the isms that it represents, but it isn't sort of doing it in that mastered, perfect way that we come to expect from the High Renaissance. So this is that like very valiant effort as we're just like working out all the kinks on our way to perfect mastery of composition and the illusion of 3-dimensional space. I hope that makes sense. We've got another one here, Lindbergh. I think this one is great on inconsistency, but many valiant attempts at these, at these ideals. So we've got linear perspective, but it's inconsistent. I mean, look at the figures. They remind me of when you have those like scenery pages for like kids' activity books, and then they give you like stickers of like characters to put on there. And so when you're trying to like stick a character on like a walkway or in front of a building, like they're never the right size to be there. And that's kind of what we got going on here, where the people are way too big for where they're supposed to be in this world. We got this very extreme vanishing point perspective on the sheep corral, and then this like giant person and these giant people right next to them. Lots of attempts at linear vanishing point perspective that are very inconsistent. This is just like really fun and really bananas in that way that it's attempting, but very inconsistent in its delivery. So no atmospheric perspective here as well. If you notice, this is sort of like a very detailed Hamlet village way back in the background that should be sort of faded and misty and not so detailed. And that figure walking his donkey towards it, one should be probably smaller than the trees of the forest. Like he's a solid, if this tree is 15 feet tall, he's definitely 13 feet tall. Like, wow. So A, he should be smaller, but B, he should be less detailed and a little bit more muted than, say, these foreground characters. So guy chopping wood, also a little bit too big, but certainly perhaps would be more detailed than the guy who's halfway to town. So that lack of atmospheric perspective, I think, really breaks the spell and adds to the inconsistency of the vanishing point linear perspective as well. So, boop, let's do another great solid attempt at vanishing point perspective. The Uccello's Battle of San Romano. I love this piece. It's fantastic. I think he had a lot more of a challenge in front of him because this is an outdoor scene. You don't have that architecture of buildings that you can like take a ruler and start like sketching pencil drawings towards a vanishing point dot that you put somewhere. So there's no geometric shapes for you to form that perspective against. So for him to kind of create that orthogonal, remember those are the lines that get closer together as they go to the vanishing point, or those orthogonals. We've got all of these dropped spears that are almost like boop, boop, boo, lined up like cordwood lattice work. We got dead guy is also lined up on an orthogonal. So he's kind of lined those up for the dropped spears that he can then sort of take his pencil and like move towards vanishing point that's, I don't know, I would assume there-ish. But as you can see, dead guy on the ground, foreshortening, he's way too over foreshortened. That dude would be like 3.5 foot tall if he stood up. Because notice how his toes are exactly at the foreground. So you've got this sort of teeny tiny, super foreshortened figure. And it's an attempt, and he's certainly like giving that moment of an orthogonal there. But it's an inconsistent illusion. The other idea is that he's made the people further away smaller, but he did not sort of atmospherically haze them out. We've still got those bright colors. So even though he made them less detailed, he did not sort of mute the bright yellows and bright reds, and it brings them too much forward. So everything is sort of arranged to accommodate linear perspective, but the illusion is inconsistent because we haven't quite mastered those check marks. So finally, Piero della Francesca's Annunciation. Here we are moving to another Annunciation. Remember we had Angelico's Annunciation earlier. So same players, Mary in her classic blue robe. Classicism. What do we have for classicism here? What are you seeing that's classical? You got the big giveaway, the architecture. Nope, go away. What's this? Stop it. Sorry about that. Rampant. All right. So perspective of the portico over the Virgin here. She's kind of in a, I don't know, covered walkway. I don't know what happened to my pointer. I'm sorry. So we've got some vanishing point perspective, even in this pretty narrow space we've been given. Humanism, reaction to Mary. She's sort of shocked, looks a bit ill feeling again, wary expression. And again, she's kind of lifted a protective hand, which may be a little bit of like a give me a minute. It's a real response. So we can sort of recognize all of those Renaissance ideals happening there. It's still a religious subject. It's still an enunciation, but again, it's happening on Earth in real space, in history, and with like real human emotions and experiences. So we've got the illusion of three-dimensional space attempted here. We've got more attention to anatomy. Certainly, if you look at Mary here, you've got sort of great shading and shadowing of that fabric. It's creating like a three-dimensional figure that takes up space. So I think this is a great evolution that you can see how it moves away from that Gothic use and understanding to this more Renaissance ideal, but in that transition of trying to make the execution match the, hope, I guess. All right, I will do this in 2 parts, and we will get back to you here in a second with the North. This has been the South.